She shut off my lake to prove a point. But 2 weeks later, her own house started cracking from the ground up the day Karen declared my lake illegal. Started like any other quiet morning. The kind where the water sits still enough to mirror the sky. I was halfway through my coffee when I noticed her standing at the edge of my property, heels sinking slightly into the soft ground. A clipboard clutched tightly against her chest like it gave her authority. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just stared out across the lake as if she were already imagining it gone. By the time I walked down to meet her, she was already talking on the phone, loudly, making sure I could hear every word. Something about unauthorized structures, community violations, and non-compliant water features. When she hung up, she turned to me with a tight, rehearsed smile and introduced herself as the HOA compliance officer. Even though everyone in the neighborhood already knew Karen didn't need a title to act like she owned the place. She didn't ask questions. She made statements. According to her, my lake was not approved under HOA guidelines. It disrupted the visual harmony of the community. It posed unknown environmental risks. And most importantly, it had never been formally reviewed by the board. I let her finish, mostly because I'd heard versions of this before. People saw the lake, assumed it was just for show, and decided it didn't belong. I tried to explain calmly that the lake wasn't some decorative project I'd dug out on a whim. It had been there long before the HOA expanded into this area. It was maintained under county guidelines, fully permitted, and connected to a carefully designed refill system that kept the water levels stable year-round. I even offered to show her the documentation, the permits, the inspection reports. She didn't even glance at them. Instead, she flipped a page on her clipboard and pointed to a line of text like it was the final word. Unapproved water features are subject to immediate compliance action, she said, her voice flat and confident. Then she looked up at me and added, almost casually, that includes shutting off any external refill sources. That was the moment I realized she didn't understand what she was talking about. I told her she needed to slow down. That cutting off the refill system wasn't just some cosmetic fix. The lake wasn't isolated, it was part of a larger balance underground. Something that affected more than just my property. But Karen just smiled again. That same tight smile. And said, "We'll be just fine without your water." Within hours, she had contractors on site. I watched as they located the refill line and began sealing it off, ignoring every attempt I made to explain what they were interfering with. Neighbors started to gather at a distance, curious, whispering among themselves. Some of them looked sympathetic, but most just seemed entertained. Like this was another HOA drama unfolding in real time. When the last valve was closed and the system went silent, Karen walked past me without a second glance. She told me I'd receive official notice of the violation and any associated fines by the end of the week. Then she left, heels clicking confidently against the pavement, already moving on as if the situation was completely resolved. That evening, I stood by the edge of the lake again. The surface looked the same, calm and undisturbed, but I knew better. Without the refill system, the slow drop would begin. It wouldn't be immediate, and it wouldn't be obvious at first, but it would happen. And when it did, it wouldn't just be my problem, because what Karen had dismissed as just a lake was quietly doing something far more important beneath the surface, something the entire neighborhood depended on, whether they realized it or not. The first few days after the refill line was shut off felt almost normal, which only made everything worse. The lake didn't vanish overnight. It receded slowly, inch by inch, subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice unless they were looking for it. But the neighborhood was looking. Word had spread fast, and suddenly my property had become a kind of spectacle. People walked by more often, some pretending it was just their usual route, others openly Armenian. He cut enus Armenian, he a enus Armenian, he na enus Armenian, he ga enus ing near the edge to watch the waterline shrink. Karen made sure everyone knew this was a win. For the community, she sent out an HOA notice framing the whole situation as a necessary step to maintain order and property standards. According to her, removing my unauthorized water feature would protect home values and eliminate potential risks. A few neighbors even congratulated her publicly, thanking her for taking action where others wouldn't. I heard the comments, saw the nods of approval, and realized how easily people sided with authority when it sounded confident enough. There were jokes too. People laughed about finally seeing what was really under there, as if my lake had been hiding something suspicious all along. A couple of residents even brought their kids by to watch, turning it into an afternoon curiosity. Each day, the shoreline pulled back just a little more, exposing damp earth that quickly dried and cracked under the sun. It didn't look dramatic yet, but it was enough to keep the conversation going. Meanwhile, the HOA wasted no time issuing fines. Notices started arriving in my mailbox, each one more formal than the last. Non-compliance penalties, restoration fees, warnings about further action if I didn't remove what remained of the lake entirely. It was like they were trying to force a conclusion before anyone had time to question whether this should have happened in the first place. Then, about a week in, the tone started to shift. It began with small complaints, the kind people usually ignore. Someone mentioned their kitchen faucet wasn't as strong as usual. Another neighbor joked about their shower pressure dropping mid-rinse. At first, it was brushed off as routine maintenance issues or temporary glitches. But the complaints didn't stop. They multiplied. Lawns that had always stayed green with minimal effort started to fade. Sprinkler systems sputtered or failed to reach their usual range. Garden beds that had been thriving just days before began to dry out, the soil losing its moisture faster than anyone expected. Still, most people didn't connect it to the lake. Not yet. By the second week, it was impossible to ignore. Water pressure across the neighborhood had dropped noticeably. Showers turned weak. Faucets ran inconsistently. Some homes experienced brief periods where the water flow cut out entirely before returning at a trickle. The HOA sent out another notice, this time claiming they were investigating potential infrastructure issues. But the confidence from earlier had started to crack. I kept quiet, but I watched. The lake had now receded far enough that its impact was visible even to those who didn't understand what they were seeing. The edges had pulled back several feet, exposing uneven ground that had never been meant to sit dry for long. Beneath the surface, the balance was shifting, just like I had tried to explain. Neighbors who had laughed days earlier were no longer joking. Conversations changed from casual amusement to quiet concern. People started comparing notes, realizing the issues weren't isolated. It wasn't just one house or one street, it was happening everywhere. One evening, I overheard a group gathered near the sidewalk, talking in low voices. Someone finally said it out loud, hesitant but clear. This started right after they shut off that lake. There was a pause, the kind that comes when a realization settles in and no one wants to be the first to fully accept it. Because the truth was becoming harder to ignore. What had been dismissed as just a decorative feature wasn't so simple. The lake had been doing something behind the scenes, something no one had bothered to understand until it was gone. And now, as the water levels continued to fall and the neighborhood's systems struggled to keep up, the same people who had cheered were starting to wonder if they had celebrated a mistake they couldn't undo. At first, Karen treated the complaints like background noise, annoying, but manageable. She sent out carefully worded updates about temporary fluctuations and assured everyone the HOA was handling it. Even as more residents reported weak water pressure and dying lawns, she held onto the same confident tone, as if repeating it enough times would make it true. Whenever my name or the lake came up, she shut it down quickly, calling it coincidence or misinformation. I tried once more to reach out. I emailed her the reports I had mentioned before: hydrology assessments, soil stability analyses, maintenance logs. I kept it simple. No accusations, just facts. I explained that the lake wasn't just holding water. It was maintaining pressure and balance beneath the surface. Removing the refill system had disrupted that balance, and the effects would continue to spread. I even offered a solution, a way to restore flow before things got worse. She didn't respond. A few days later, the first crack appeared. It was small, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, a thin line stretching across the edge of Karen's waterfront patio. Someone snapped a picture and posted it in the neighborhood group. asking if anyone else had noticed similar damage. The comments filled quickly. Some dismissed it as normal settling. Others joked about poor construction. Karen herself replied with a short message saying it was being evaluated, and there was no cause for concern. But the crack didn't stay small. Within a couple of days, it widened just enough to catch the light differently, turning from a faint line into something more visible, more real. Then another appeared, branching off at an angle like a fracture spreading through glass. The ground near the edge of her property began to shift ever so slightly, creating uneven patches where everything had once been perfectly level. That's when people started paying attention. Reports came in from other waterfront homes, minor at first, then increasingly serious. Hairline fractures along driveways, patio tiles lifting at the corners, doors that didn't close quite right anymore. It wasn't dramatic. Not yet. But it was consistent. And consistency was harder to ignore than coincidence. Karen still refused to connect it to the lake. She called in a local contractor to inspect her property. And for a brief moment, it seemed like she might finally be taking things seriously. But when neighbors asked what the contractor found, her answer was vague. Routine settling. She said, nothing unusual. She doubled down in the next HOA notice, insisting there was no evidence linking the issues to any recent changes. But the ground told a different story. Without the steady water level the lake had maintained, the soil beneath these homes was starting to dry out and contract. It wasn't something you could see happening in real time, but the results were impossible to hide. The same land that had supported perfectly stable, premium waterfront properties was now shifting under pressure it wasn't designed to handle. I watched it unfold from a distance, a mix of frustration and inevitability settling in. This was exactly what I had tried to prevent. And now it was happening piece by piece, right in front of everyone. One evening, I noticed Karen standing at the edge of her patio, staring down at the cracks. For the first time since this started, she didn't look confident. She didn't have her clipboard. Didn't have that rehearsed expression ready. She just stood there, silent, as if trying to figure out when things had started slipping out of her control. The next day, more photos appeared online. Wider cracks, uneven ground, a short video of someone placing a marble on their patio and watching it roll on its own, pulled by a slope that hadn't existed a week before. The comments were different now, less dismissive, more uneasy. People were asking questions Karen couldn't easily brush aside. And still, she said nothing about the lake. But the connection was becoming impossible to deny. The timing, the pattern, the location, it all pointed back to the same moment. The same decision. The day she ordered the refill system shut off. What had once been advertised as a selling point, those calm, picturesque waterfront views, was now turning into the center of a growing problem. The closer a home was to where the lake had been most stable, the more noticeable the damage seemed to be. By the end of the week, it wasn't just a few cracks anymore. It was a pattern spreading across the very properties that had been considered the most valuable in the entire neighborhood. And for the first time, people weren't just concerned. They were starting to realize something had gone very, very wrong. The shift in attitude came almost overnight. The same HOA that had been so quick to issue fines and warnings was suddenly scrambling to control a situation that was no longer contained. Complaints had turned into formal reports, and formal reports had turned into demands for answers. Homeowners weren't just asking questions anymore, they were documenting damage, comparing timelines, and, most importantly, looking for someone to hold responsible. Karen's tone changed, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of acknowledging what was happening, she went on the offensive. Another notice went out, this one sharper, more defensive, warning residents against spreading false narratives about the cause of the damage. My name was mentioned directly this time. According to her, I had interfered with community infrastructure, and any issues being experienced were the result of unauthorized modifications on my property. It didn't take long for that accusation to reach me. At first, I almost laughed. After everything that had happened, after all the warnings I had given, the idea that I was being blamed for following their orders was almost absurd. But the more I thought about it, The more I realized this wasn't a mistake, it was a strategy. If the HOA could shift responsibility onto me, they might avoid the consequences of their own decision. Still, this wasn't something they could manage with notices and emails alone anymore. Too many homes were affected, and the damage was becoming too visible. Residents began hiring their own inspectors, bringing in professionals who had no connection to the HOA. Reports started circulating quietly at first, then more openly, each one pointing toward the same underlying issue: soil instability caused by changes in groundwater conditions. That's when the engineers arrived. They weren't brought in by Karen or the HOA board. They were hired collectively by a group of homeowners who wanted independent answers. Unlike the earlier contractor visits, this wasn't a quick walkthrough or a surface-level inspection. They surveyed the entire area, taking measurements, examining the exposed ground where the lake had receded, and reviewing historical data about the land itself. For the first time since this started, someone was looking at the full picture. I saw them more than once, moving methodically around the neighborhood, placing markers, recording notes, and asking questions that no one from the HOA had bothered to ask. When they reached my property, I gave them everything I had: permits, maintenance records, the same reports I had tried to show Karen weeks earlier. This time, someone actually read them. It didn't take long for their findings to start spreading. At first, it was just summaries shared between neighbors, bits of information passed along in conversations. Then someone posted a section of the report online, and everything changed. The language was technical, but the conclusion was clear enough for anyone to understand. The sudden loss of water input from the lake had disrupted the local groundwater balance, leading to soil contraction and structural stress in nearby properties. In simpler terms, the problem had a starting point, and that starting point matched exactly with the day the HOA ordered the refill line shut off. The reaction was immediate. Residents who had once supported Karen were now questioning everything. Some were angry, others just stunned. But almost everyone was looking back at the same moment and realizing how quickly things had spiraled from a simple compliance issue into something far more serious. Karen tried to respond. She called for a meeting, framing it as an opportunity to clarify misinformation. But by the time people gathered, the tone in the room was completely different from anything she was used to. This wasn't a group looking for guidance, it was a group demanding accountability. Questions came fast, direct, and impossible to deflect. Why was the refill system shut off without a full assessment? Why were warnings ignored? Why was blame being shifted instead of addressed? For once, Karen didn't have immediate answers. She repeated phrases about procedure, about authority, about acting in the community's best interest. But the confidence behind those words was gone. Every explanation sounded thinner than the last, especially when compared to the detailed findings people were now holding in their hands. The truth had a weight to it that her statements couldn't match. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that the narrative had shifted completely. What had started as an HOA enforcement action was now being seen for what it really was: a decision made without understanding the consequences. One that had triggered a chain reaction affecting the entire neighborhood. And no matter how much Karen tried to redirect the blame, the evidence pointed in one direction. The very action meant to fix the problem had created it. By the time Karen came to my door, the confidence she once carried was completely gone. There was no clipboard, no rehearsed tone, no attempt to assert authority. She stood there quietly for a moment before speaking, as if she had to force the words out. Behind her, the neighborhood looked different now: patches of dry Arabic halif, Arabic lamb, Arabic hamza talif, Arabic rod, Arabic dada, where grass used to thrive. Uneven walkways, and distant sounds of ongoing repairs that never seemed to fix anything for long. She didn't waste time with excuses. She told me the situation had escalated beyond what the HOA could handle internally. More homes were reporting structural issues, and the engineers' findings had made it impossible to deny the connection. Insurance companies were getting involved. Claims were being filed, and property values were already starting to drop. What had once been marketed as a premium waterfront community was quickly turning into something buyers wanted to avoid. Then she said the one thing I had been expecting. even if I didn't think she would ever actually say it. They needed the lake back. Not just restored, but restored immediately. She explained that the HOA was prepared to reverse its previous decision, to lift any fines, to cover the cost of restarting the refill system, whatever it took. There was even talk of issuing a formal statement acknowledging that shutting it off had been a mistake, though she avoided phrasing it quite that directly. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a long pause, the kind where the weight of everything that had happened settled into the space between us. I looked past her toward the lake, or what remained of it. The water line had dropped far enough now that the exposed ground had fully dried in places, forming deep, uneven cracks that stretched along the edges. It didn't look like something you could simply refill and return to normal. I told her the truth. Restarting the system wasn't like flipping a switch. The balance that had been disrupted wasn't just about water levels, it was about time, pressure, and the way the ground had already responded to the change. The soil had contracted, shifted, and in some places, settled into new positions. Even if the lake were refilled, it wouldn't immediately reverse what had already happened beneath the surface. She tried to push back, asking if anything could be done faster, if there was some temporary solution, some way to stabilize things while the system recovered. But the urgency in her voice only highlighted how late the request had come. The damage wasn't theoretical anymore. It was already there, built into the ground under every affected home. Over the next few days, the HOA moved quickly. Notices were sent out reversing previous violations. Contractors returned, this time to reopen the same refill line they had sealed so confidently just weeks before. Equipment was brought in, and for the first time since all of this started, water began flowing back into the lake. At first, it was almost reassuring to see the surface slowly rising, inch by inch, as if things were finally moving in the right direction. But the neighborhood didn't recover the same way. The cracks didn't disappear. Some stopped spreading, but others continued to widen, especially in areas where the ground had shifted the most. Homes closest to the original shoreline showed the worst of its foundations under stress. Patios uneven, structures no longer sitting quite the way they were designed to. Even as the water returned, the stability that had once been taken for granted didn't come back with it. People noticed. Conversations changed again. But this time there was no denial, no misplaced confidence, just a quiet understanding that what had been lost couldn't be fully restored. The lake might look whole again eventually, but the consequences of draining it had already left their mark. Karen didn't return after that first visit. I saw her occasionally from a distance, moving through the neighborhood with a much lower profile than before. The authority she once projected had been replaced by something else, something quieter, more cautious, whether it was regret or simply the realization of what had happened. It was hard to tell. As for the neighborhood, it never quite went back to what it was. The lake still filled, slowly reclaiming its place in the landscape. But now it carried a different meaning. It wasn't just a feature anymore. It was a reminder of how quickly decisions made without understanding can spiral into consequences no one can control. And how even the people who think they have authority over everything can end up facing the results of what they set in motion. In the end, they got their lake back, but not before the damage had already been done.